And we are live. And this is the part, Glenn, where we're supposed to have the little jingle that we finally sort of agreed to. But I don't actually know how to incorporate the jingle into Google Hangouts. So
We just play it in the background.
do you think that'll actually work?
I, why not? It's audio, right? Just play it on
Sort of,
your
yeah.
play it on your computer. I think it would. Maybe it will work. I don't know.
Well, it's here. Here,
Or,
let's
or put it
try
on your
that.
or put it on your cell phone.
Okay, now here we go. Here we go.
Play it on your cell phone. I do not hear it. You have a cell phone? You can play it on your cell phone through your speaker and hold it near your mic.
Yeah. How about I don't do that? Okay, so there you go. That will have to be excitement for the next episode of for HP. We'll edit it in post fact if I can figure out how to do that. So it's been a little while. We had a little time off for Christmas there, and there was a little bit of a false start on December 21st when I thought we were having a good thing, and I apparently can't keep track of the fact that we do this bi-weekly, not weekly. I was just so excited to do another one. I was all ready to go. But hey, we're here now. So what do you want to start with? Shall we get things rolling with one of my HTTP patterns?
I think that sounds great. First, I guess first what I just want to say is that send a Happy New Year to everyone, all of our listeners. And we are that was not an early April Fool's joke. The few episodes that we did before, we really are trying to commit to this going forward. We just had that slight gap, which we agreed on because of the holidays, that we would take a break. But we are looking forward to try to be consistent. Consistent is one of our resolutions for 2018. So hopefully every 2 weeks you will get to have another dose of Daryl and I.
Will we be consistently late at getting started too?
Is that going to be the resolution?
It's our thing.
That is a very that is a very easy resolution. So I kind of like that. Maybe we have one that is hard and one that is easy. Yeah, so not be on time. Yes, consistently not on time, I think is super easy. Now we just need a third resolution, and then we'll be good.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so let's get started with a HTTP pattern, which is my favorite named HTTP pattern. It's always a bit of a challenge when coming with these patterns. It's like, okay, I got to give this a name. So this is what I call the whack-a-mole pattern. And the idea is that you have a resource that when you delete it, it reappears somewhere else as a different resource. So this is used when somebody wants to take some resource and they want to remove it, cancel it, make it inactive. They want to archive some kind of entity, but the system wants to maintain a history that that thing did exist at some point in time, and also make that available as a distinct resource. Now, maybe it's a completely read-only secondary resource, and the thing is, we have this HTTP method delete, which conceptually means, yes, I don't want it anymore. But that doesn't mean that it actually has to correspond directly to physically removing that resource. I mean, it's much like in the HTTP world, in the SQL world, we used to have this notion of soft deletes, where you would just mark something as tagged. Whereas in the HTTP world, we can actually move it and put it in a different place and give it a different identifier to signify that it has been deleted. One extra little thing, you could do things like add a location header in the response to say, well, I've deleted it, and now you'll find the canceled or archived version of it over there. This isn't the only way that you can do this. You can do this simply by having like a status attribute that you can go in and change the status to canceled or change the status to deleted. But there's some nice advantages of just using the delete method itself. If you have something that uses caching, then delete indicates that please to the intermediary caches that you should actually flush that cached copy. And it also infers that that status change is likely to be a one-way change because you're deleting something. There's no undelete method, although that's not completely impossible. But it conveys the message that this is a more permanent type of status change on the resource. So that is the whack-a-mole pattern.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you give us some examples of APIs that are using this today?
Public ones?
Yes.
Now,
to be fair, Daryl was not prepared for this question.
But you're right. That is definitely something that, if I'm going to claim that it is a pattern, then I should at least be able to come up with at least one or two public examples of somebody who actually did that, right? Yep.
Mainly I did this just to see what your reaction would be.
Let me take that back to the team.
Okay. Awesome.
So one thing that I thought would be worth having a little conversation about, so that you don't mention that thing that we shall not name, is we should change have a little kind of recap of the current state of hypermedia in the world. And because there's been a number of new efforts recently. I mean, it's not only just about HAL anymore. And Siren, sorry, Kevin.
Is it worth up-leveling a bit and just giving blurb for people that might be new of just, like the 2-sentence, what is hypermedia?
Sure.
Why don't you do that?
Oh, you want me to do that? Okay, sure. So hypermedia is very simply, it's just we take an HTTP resource, and when you return a representation, not only do you include data in that representation, you also include links to indicate to the client that, oh, if you follow this link, it will do this other thing. We live it every single day in the web browser. We follow links that are returned from a web server all the time. And this same concept can be applied to APIs. People struggle to cross that chasm, but it's not nearly as hard as people think to actually apply that same concept over to APIs.
Yeah, I think one of the things, honestly, is that there's a kind of mystique around the term. It's not a term that most people, even though, hypermedia is really central to what the web was created for. And even if you read the HTTP spec, this is quite prominent. I think that I've seen, having talked about hypermedia for many years, that when people first hear it, it just doesn't sound very natural. It's almost like an esoteric quality to it. And I think that contributes to people's fear.
Well, I think one of the things that causes that mystique is that some of the ways that it's presented and sold and shown are, and we'll go back to HAL, Mike Kelly created the HAL browser. And it was a generic client that just allowed you to explore connected HAL resources.
Yes.
And the extension that people take from that is, wait, so how is my client going to do anything? It has to discover and magically know how to do things. And that's not the case at all. The only thing is, now on the client side, you have to bind your knowledge and your domain knowledge to link relations instead of to links themselves. So what we currently do with HTTP APIs is we build client code that says, well, when you go and hit whack customer, whack ID, you're going to get back a customer object. So all hypermedia does is say, well, no, if you follow a link relation called customer, then you're going to get back a customer object. And I don't really know what the URI is, but I don't really care, because when I follow this relation called customer, I'm going to get a customer back. It's just adding a layer of indirection. So clients are coupled on link relations instead of coupled on URIs. So it's not this magical the client is going to discover everything and learn exactly how to do everything. What it can learn about is new resources, because you can include new links in the payload. So now if you add another link in the payload that has a customer, well, it knows how to deal with customers, and it can discover magically new resources, just like your web browser can discover new web pages. When we add a new page to a website, we don't go and update the web browser. So it's resources that can be discovered magically, not semantics of your application.
Yeah, I think part of the problem too is the mental model. Like many developers, if you take a developer who's worked with the web, often the mental model that, and Mike Amundsen said a lot of talks about this, the mental model that developers often bring to building web apps is similar to the mental model that they use for building general server applications and concepts like RPC, like this idea of like, hey, I'm just calling a function or, an object with a bunch of functions. And once you bring that mental model there, it's like, well, when I write code today in, whatever language I write, and let's say I wasn't using APIs, I don't have to think about links and things like that. I think it has just a foreign feel to it. And the browser did a really good job of making it so that, in the browser world, it makes sense, but I don't have to think about it because a lot of that stuff is just handled for me automatically. Yeah. So I think the mental model is part of it as well. But anyway, stepping forward, thanks for that intro. Let's talk about the state.
So, mentioning some new efforts that are happening around REST, you tweeted, I think, a few weeks ago about a thing called RESTful JSON.
Yes.
And it seems like a super simple way of moving forward. So, what's that all about?
Yeah, so what RESTful JSON is about, so it's Mark Foster and I can't remember the other guy. I really apologize. It's early. But basically what RESTful JSON is about is, so we were talking a bit about hypermedia. And the concept of hypermedia has started to get out there in more and more APIs. One of the canonical examples that a lot of people in the hypermedia community were excited about was when GitHub introduced their API that had all these different links. And, traditionally, the way the hypermedia community was doing this was, like I would say the concept, you have this concept of a rel and a URL, and you would have this kind of model. And GitHub came up with a simplistic model, which was saying, hey, we just have a convention where we have this like underscore URL on resources, and when you see that, that that's a link, and it'd be like underscore something something URL underscore something something URL. I think it's underscore. I may be wrong in my memory. So what what RESTful JSON really is trying to do is, going back to your comment about, hey, if I'm going to present a pattern, I should be able to find real world examples. They've gone out there and they've looked at various examples of hypermedia that are in the wild. And I would say moving away from, I don't want to use the word pedantic, but looking at, some of the newer ideas that people are coming with of how to make a hypermedia more digestible and some of these convention-based approaches. And they've said, let's canonicalize that. Let's come up with a standard that says, hey, here's a way that you can do it. And we've based this on some common examples of APIs out there like GitHub.
And they also mention Stripe, Medium, Basecamp, Trello.
Exactly.
And these framework.
And I think a big value of this is what gives them a lot of credibility is these are all APIs lots of people know and may not even realize that there's hypermedia coming into play there. So I think it's a great effort. I was really excited. Mark told me about it actually 6 or 8 months ago. We got together and I was in San Francisco, and we after going on a really cool hike where he actually had a tick fall on him, but we found it. He explained it to me, and I thought it was of course there'll be some that will criticize it and say, oh no, this is bad, but if we look at this idea of making it easier for people to approach hypermedia and making them have to jump through less hoops. Because I think that's the thing. This convention-based approach of just tacking things on like this is kind of really simple. But once it could get standardized, you could then even bring it to tooling. You know, like right now, you can't have a standard client that really understands that. I mean, you could, but there's no standard to attach it to. But once you have some type of standard that's agreed on, that allows you know, people to come together and build a standard ecosystem of tooling on top. So anyway, that's the part that I took away. There may be more to it, but for me, it was a standardized way to represent links, and based on some, you know, very common, well-known APIs which give it credibility.
Yeah. So the other author was Stephen Mizell, and I took the link.
Yeah, who's going to be mad at me? But yes.
I posted the link to the website in our Slack channel, or in the Mood for HTTP Slack channel, which you can get access to on slack.httpapis.com, if I remember that URI correctly.
Impressive.
Yes, yes. So just to go, the interesting
just want to mention one thing. If you do join our Slack, we actually have a channel called In the Mood for HTTP, and we're always posting you know, links to the links related to the shows, and you can put questions there and things like that.
Because we like questions. We like, because it requires us to plan less when it comes to preparing. The one thing I wanted to say about the interesting thing for me is the way that this kind of RESTful JSON pattern works is you have the prefix underscore URL, right? And the prefix then effectively becomes your link relation.
Yes.
That's where your semantics are attached to. So it's really just a different serialization format for URLs. The only downside of it is that generally that URL is just a string value. So you can't attach other metadata that sometimes you might want to attach.
And you're also, and you're also somewhat limited in what you could represent. I mean, you could try and obviously pack that key name, like you said, but yeah.
We'll come back to this conversation in a minute.
Well, I also think it's interesting in terms of the convention-based approach. A lot of developers really like the idea of conventions. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something that people naturally are able to attach to. Like, oh, if I see this, that's a pattern. I know what it is.
Yeah. So the other one that you flagged was an interesting development is a slightly more sophisticated hypermedia approach, which is called HyperGoal, right?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yeah. So it's still very, very young. It's still very much kind of a work in progress. Actually, it hasn't been having much work. So I was kind of interested to see that recently it started to get some traction. But so I gave a talk a while ago at API Days New Zealand on this concept of hypermedia-based workflow. So what HyperGoal is really about is an approach, you know, traditional workflow tends to be more driven by the server side, where, you know, events happen and the server is the one who is coordinating and guiding and saying, okay, so we're going to do like an order process. It's going to be step A, step B, step C. There may be branching logic as well, but it's all being driven by the server. And one of the things that hypermedia really brings to the forefront is this idea of the client driving. And it's not something new. It's like that's how the browser works. The server returns you something, you read it, you're the human, you read that, and then you choose where you want to go next. So Mike Amundsen had been doing a lot of work around this space with things like his Miss Grant's controller, which maybe we can share a link to that. And I can actually share a link to my talk as well. I'll post that in the Slack, which was an approach of like, hey, you know, imagine a situation where there's a maze, there's a room, and there's a bunch of things you need to do in that room. You have a goal that you're trying to achieve. And how could a hypermedia client drop into that room and navigate around to try to achieve that goal? So this is different than the server just guiding it and telling it what to do. Rather, the server is more giving options to the client, or I should say the API is giving options to the client that make sense to lead it toward that goal. And so what HyperGoal was about is saying, well, imagine we took it outside of the context of just like a room, and we said, imagine like a real like process in the real world, like that we do today with APIs, like booking travel. Right. So my goal coming in would be, I want to get to a certain event or a certain location on such and such date. And so using a HyperGoal approach, instead of the server basically guiding me through every, sending me to each step, the server could say, okay, well, here's the first set of things, you need to do. And I get to choose, and it becomes that kind of navigation. And it works very well for the web in the sense that it's using application state. The server doesn't have to have any state. So the client keeps track of this navigation flow that it's going through, and it sends that every time to this concept of an agent that can then say, oh, well, here's where you are now. Based on where you're trying to get to, this is the next set of things you need to deal with. So that's kind of the idea, but it's still putting a lot of choice into the client. The agent is not making the decisions. It's just saying, based on what I know about what you're trying to do and where you are, these are the next possible places that you can go. Yeah. So anyway, that was the idea. And a bunch of us came together at ResFest years ago to formulate this and just explore it. And recently what happened is this gentleman, Attilo, went and he basically had taken this idea after seeing my talk in New Zealand about over a year ago, and went and tried to implement it within his company. And he found it was really, really beneficial, and he's done some blog posts about it. So I think it's still very early, but it was really cool to see somebody going beyond the theory of what we came up with to actually try to implement this. Yep. And one of the key things that's exciting about it is that in that traditional workflow system that I was describing, it tends to be a very closed model where there's some workflow engine that knows about a finite set of things. And so one of the ideas of HyperGoal was it embraced this idea of that there could be zillions of different workflows. And it even looked at things like JSON LD, which is a whole other topic around using self-description to allow this expanding vocabulary. So it's going to sound very meta, and it is meta. What I found interesting about the blog post is it's actually trying to say, here's a real use case that we use this for, which I think was actually an identity workflow, which is interesting. So anyway, I won't go further than that, but it was just for me personally, it was exciting to see something that we started on and didn't really go forward with, other than thinking about it, to translate it from a thought experiment to something real. And I'll post some of the links from Attilo's posts.
This is a challenge that we've consistently faced in the hypermedia community, is everybody keeps going, where are all the examples? And to see people actually building something that takes advantage of these capabilities and brings real world value to it is super exciting. Wow, did I just say super exciting?
You've been at Microsoft too long. I do want to say one thing, which is I messed up his name. It's Attilio, not Attilo.
On that theme, and I wish I could say more, but I had a call yesterday with a large technology company that showed me documentation for their API that they're hoping to make public in the coming year that describes all of their capabilities using link relations.
Awesome.
And they've done a full hypermedia-driven API over their platform, which is really, really interesting, especially because it is a large technology company. So that'll be great to see in the wild when it happens.
Awesome.
So the last newcomer, shall we say, in the hypermedia space that I wanted to say a little thing about is Hyperschema. So Hyperschema is pretty much just an extension, a vocabulary extension of JSON schema. JSON schema has tremendous amount of usage But sadly, a couple of years ago, it kind of stalled in a kind of draft state, and its owners had paying work to do and they weren't able to continue working on it. And recently it's been picked up by some fresh new blood who are putting a ton of effort into continuing the JSON schema work and enhancing it and resolving certain issues and improving and addressing new concerns. And one of the things that they've introduced is this notion of hyperschema, which allows you to, where JSON schema provides validation annotations on top of a JSON document, so you can make sure that data is the right type within the right range, strings are the correct pattern. This allows you to say, oh, and by the way, you can create links from these pieces of data. So it uses URI templates and combined with the data in the JSON object in order to allow a client to create links that it can follow from a response. So it's quite a unique approach in that it can be layered on top of responses that don't have any links in, and it avoids that. You sometimes get the response back from people, oh, I don't want to put all those links into my responses because it adds bulk to the responses and I'm concerned about performance. Well, this allows you to have these external annotations that just tell you, okay, take this data and apply it to these URI templates, and then you'll be able to discover what the links are. So it's a different approach than kind of the HAL, Siren, JSON schema way of doing things, which I think is really kind of cool.
Yeah, it sounds very cool.
And the other interesting thing, whilst looking at the hyperschema spec that I discovered, is it referenced this spec, which said was 8288. And whenever I see a number that I've never seen before, I go, what on earth is this 8288? And I went there, and 8288 is a new revision of 5988, which was 5988 was the original web link in spec. You know how when we were talking about RESTful JSON, I said, well, the problem with just adding underscore URL to the end is the only thing you can describe is the link relation type. Sure. And sometimes other people will want to add other attributes to a link.
Yeah.
Well, 5988 is the original spec that told you what are the other attributes that you're allowed to add to a link. And it also is the spec that describes how to do links in HTTP headers.
The headers, yep.
So 8288 is an updated version of that spec. I had no idea Mark Nottingham was updating the spec, and I haven't yet had time to actually go through and diff on it and find out what is different and what has been changed within that spec. But it's interesting to see that there is evolution, even in things that were considered fairly static insofar as, well, we all know what a link is, but there's changes going on there. So I will report back in a future episode as to what has changed in 8288.
I have a question for you on that note, and this is probably more related to some of our listeners who might be newer to HTTP. So there's this concept of links, of course, that you can embed in the payload. There's links that you can put in headers. Talk a little bit about that. What's the difference between those two? I mean, we can keep it brief, but I think it's just useful always to kind of bring it back.
Yeah, and there are lots of formats out there that just don't naturally adapt well to having links inserted in them, as in like a picture image. If you're doing some kind of photo app where you want to allow somebody to scroll through a gallery of photos and you render them a photo, you can't really insert a textual link inside that JPEG or GIF image. So by using HTTP headers to embed the links in, you can send the links to find the next and previous image or some kind of related image. And not actually affect the payload. And of course, there's a whole slew of other possibilities that you can put in link headers, using it for things like described by. So you can point to documentation about a particular resource, or you can point to a schema of a particular resource where the link truly is metadata that you don't want to embed into the actual response itself. So link headers has a fairly awkward syntax, but that's primarily just because of the character rules for HTTP headers, which originally came from the rules of email headers. So it's a bit weird. So it's always a good idea just to find a parser that already has all those rules encoded in it, so that you can just say, here's my URL and here's some attributes, and let it serialize it out rather than trying to read the specs to figure it out yourself. But they generally are available in most languages. But link headers are a very handy alternative way.
I think I heard I think it was in Richardson. I think it was in the RESTful Web Services book that there was an example of like a map, which was like an image. I could be off, but if not, this is a good use case. A map that has, you know, links for like navigating around the map, for zooming into the map.
Yep.
Going back to your example, but just giving something that's a little more tangible than just, hey, like a photo. I mean, you could imagine
previous.
Yeah,
yes.
But you could also imagine a photo having like retouch, auto retouch, things like that also being exposed as link headers. And I guess an interesting one, which I never thought about until this call, was if you were in a situation where even if you were using a payload that could accept links, but you weren't in a situation where you could maybe modify that payload, link headers might be a way to allow you to introduce some hypermedia without, you know, let's just say you were in a situation where it's like, we can't change this code, but, you know, we have these requirements and these needs.
Yep.
It's a little bit, you know, it's a little bit pulling out of the air, but if you were in that situation, link headers,
you can transparently add on additional links without really upsetting the client, because clients tend to ignore headers that they don't recognize fairly easily. And to just go back to your image thing, it's always better to add link headers in rather than taking the other approach, which is taking the image and bin hexing it into a JSON document so that you...
Well, that kills your client consumption story, which is one of the beauties about my contact manager demo would not have worked if I had modified the image to have the submitted.
Yeah.
I guess
and speaking of specs that have changed and updated, been replaced, did you know that there's a new JSON spec?
I did not.
So 8259 is the new.
Is this part of the 2018?
So I think Tim Bray, who's the editor of the spec, basically said the only thing they've really done it for is to align with who's the other the body that has it. So like IETF have a JSON spec and ECMA have a JSON spec, and they finally have made it so that they're both say the same thing. The other thing is they've basically said, thou shalt only use UTF-8. No more UTF-16 for public stuff. So,
gotcha.
Because that used to be a bit of a confusing thing as to encoding. So yes, a new JSON spec. Fortunately, not a whole lot different in there. There was another whole topic that I was thinking that we could get into. I don't know whether you saw that blog post about REST is the new SOAP.
I love his posts. He also has a post about that technology that shall not, or that.
Oh no, that was Phil Sturgeon's response to the original one.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there was an original one that really basically just trashed REST.
Oh no, I saw that one. Yeah. No, I'm just saying I like Phil's. You know,
he's got a very pragmatic response to, and I use pragmatic in a positive light there, as opposed to my usual use of the term. But yes, we'll post links. It's worth reading it to understand people's perspectives, both the original post and Phil's response. And read all. I added a lot of comments myself on the original post because it's full of what I would consider completely false information.
Yes,
and we have to recognize
the GraphQL. The GraphQL one was the same way.
Yeah.
Oops! I said it.
We have to recognize that this is a reality that we have to deal with. Is people learn from reading other things, and they will not always get correct ideas, and don't take it out on the person. Recognize that there's just a lot of false information out there, and we all need to do our best to try and correct that where we can in the most civilized way possible. Last thing I want to say is that we do now have a podcast feed. I am taking these things and turning them into audio files and uploading them to a place where you can sign up with your favorite podcast reader. One caveat to that is don't bother trying to look for it in iTunes, because iTunes refuses to validate the feed. And if you read the documentation, it says, go use the W3C validator to make sure that your feed is valid. And I do, and it's perfectly valid, but iTunes says, no, it's not valid, and it won't tell me why. So I only have a limited amount of capacity to be able to try and debug these things. I will keep trying to figure out why, but currently you just have to take the URL, and iTunes podcast tool accepts it just fine.
We have another announcement. We actually have gotten the blog launched, although it is very much behind, but we do have the first episode out there, and at some point we will catch up and we will have all the other episodes out there. So that blog is on Medium. So if you go to medium.com, and then it is in the mood for the number 4, like our Twitter account, HTTP. Also, if you're not aware, we do have a Twitter account, which is in the mood for number 4 HTTP. Last thing I just wanted to do was give a plug for our sponsor, Auth0.
Yay!
Yeah, so Auth0 is the new way to solve identity. We solve the most complex industry use cases with an extensible and easy to integrate platform, and we are securing billions of logins every month. So you can use Auth0. You can sign up for it for free. Just go to auth0.com.
Well, thank you very much, Glenn, for taking your time out today, and I hope you have an excellent rest of the day.
Same, Daryl.
Take care.
Bye-bye.